Welcome to Below the Line, where we talk about working in Hollywood from the crew perspective. My name is Skid. I'm a former assistant director and your host.
Quiet on the set.
Our Oscar series highlighting the technical categories continues, and today is episode 5 of 10. We're talking about the Academy Award nominees for Best Animated Feature, and I'm happy to welcome back my guests from last year. First, Kent Seki. You're a 20-year Hollywood veteran, and your animated credits include Megamind, The Boss Baby, and the upcoming Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Mutant Mayhem, which will be out this August. Nice to see you again.
It's good to be here.
Also returning, Camille Leganza. You've been working on animated films for more than 20 years yourself, with credits including The Incredibles, The Secret of Kells, and going back to your start in the industry, The Iron Giant. Welcome back to Below the Line.
Thanks for having me back.
I'm excited to have you both here. Listeners, if you want to learn more about Kent and Camille, please look them up on the Internet Movie Database. Below the Line has its own page on IMDb, so it's easy to start on a specific episode and simply click through to see the film credits of my guests. The 5 animated films recognized by the Academy this year are Guillermo del Toro's Pinocchio, Marcel the Shell with Shoes On, Puss in Boots: The Last Wish, The Sea Beast, and Turning Red. We're going to discuss them in that order, and spoilers are possible, so consider this a warning. Additionally, I'm offering my apologies in advance in case I mispronounce the names of any nominees. First up, Guillermo del Toro's Pinocchio, and the credited team is Guillermo del Toro, Mark Gustafson, Gary Ungar, and Alex Bulkley.
Guillermo del Toro's Pinocchio, it is the front runner, right? Like it won the Golden Globe. I loved it. I absolutely adore Guillermo del Toro's storytelling, the production design, the fact that it's stop motion. Every single frame is so beautiful of this film that it really won me over. I know it was his passion project. I think they announced that it was in development in 2008, which is almost as long as I've known Kent, by the way.
That's old, man. Oh my God.
I know, it was a while ago. But, it sounds like Guillermo del Toro really struggled to bring this film to life. And I know it was a very personal story for him. And so I think you can just feel it. I love the production design. I loved the darkness of it, the death elements in the kind of other world. And I thought Shadow Machine, the studio that did most of the stop motion animation, did a fantastic job. What did you think, Kent?
I loved it. I was blown away by this film. And what a lot of people don't realize is that Guillermo del Toro is a huge animation fan. And it takes an animation fan to make an animated film, I think, in a lot of ways, because of the process is so time intensive. Camille and I worked together at DreamWorks, and there was a time in which Guillermo del Toro came to the studio to advise on several pictures, and it was a huge thrill to have someone of his stature really take an interest in the animation field. And when you see what he has made using the medium of animation, it really is amazing. And the fortitude it takes to make an animated film, the attention to detail and the perseverance, a lot of people don't realize how long these things take to make. And even conceptually, this film being so dark and being very Guillermo del Toro in the way of Pan's Labyrinth, of Shape of Water, of all of his sort of his natural taste, to get this made was an incredible journey. He has this quote, I think it was like, I would come in and I would say, it's about death and life and the rise of Mussolini, and they would validate my parking and send me on my way, and he went to almost every major studio to try to get this made. And I think in many ways, I would like a tip of the hat to Netflix for agreeing to make this. And this is a place where you really see the advantage of all these streaming services trying to get into the game of animation because they're willing to take these risks. I mean, Wolfwalker from Apple, which was, again, some people that Camille worked with,
Cartoon Saloon,
Secret of Kells, gets these movies made, helps to get fund and get these movies made. This is no exception. Even though it's a big name like Guillermo del Toro as a passion project, it really is. It took 1,000 days to shoot it. That's extraordinary when you think about anyone that works in the industry who's worked on a live action set. There's no shoots that are 1,000-day shoots. That's a lot of photography that's happening across a long period of time, and it's a very labor intensive process, and you have to be really into it. And I like to look at this movie and draw a parallel to Pan's Labyrinth. There's thematically, when I saw Pan's Labyrinth, you sort of saw, Guillermo del Toro is almost a modern Luis Buñuel, and sort of the framing of a fantastical story in fascist Spain, and this is the framing of a fantastical story in fascist Italy. And you really see this sort of political discussion happening sort of behind the scenes of this movie, and the idea of conformism and not, and sort of rebelling against it. This movie is very much a movie about rebellion. I think the character of Pinocchio, and I've had debates with some of my compatriots about this. Some people have found him annoying because he is so rebellious. But I think that was thematically something that Guillermo del Toro really wanted to talk about in this film, and it's really evident in the DNA of it, the idea of disobedience as a virtue.
Mm-hmm.
I would describe Guillermo del Toro as a rebellious person, and I think his film embodies very much his persona of that, and I really enjoyed it. The fact that co-writer is Patrick McHale, who wrote on Adventure Time, adds a whimsy to it that is only enhanced by the stop motion. And it's really amazing, the craftsmanship. I just look at this film, and the photography is beautiful, is absolutely stunning. It's something that you don't really talk about a lot in anime films. Oh, the cinematography. The cinematography in this film is extraordinary, and it just adds to the mystique of the miniatures. It really does.
Mm-hmm.
It really enhances it in a lot of ways.
I saw Guillermo del Toro speak about the making of Pinocchio at the NFC Film Festival last year, and he previewed a couple of scenes, and one of the ones that he previewed was the scene where Geppetto is kind of drunk and stumbling around, and he talked about how he really wanted to show the imperfections of these characters in the animation. And it's so different than, like, when you look at CG animation and how perfect it can look, the nuances and subtleties of the stop motion animation, those little real life things that people do are there, like creaky knees and rubbing his brow, and just, you can tell he's in pain. And you can do that in CG, but for some reason there is such a heaviness in stop motion that kind of comes across those characters, and that's something that he had mentioned really wanting to capture. And so when I watched it, that's really what I was looking for initially, is just like, what are all those little moments that are Guillermo del Toro, making this animated film? And I love it. And yes, like, we were so lucky to work with him at DreamWorks when he came in as a consultant. And the fact that he has been so close to animation for so long and is such a champion of animation, and being that vocal about animation is cinema. You can tell any kind of story. It's not a genre. He's one of our biggest cheerleaders, and I can't thank him enough, because it's true. You can tell any kind of story with animation.
Yeah, he really is somebody that bridges that live action to animation gap. There's only a handful of directors who've done both successfully, and he is definitely one of them. And we've sort of been, those of us in the animation community who know he's a fan, well, this is what we've been waiting for, is to see something that he's hand created, and it has the imprint of him all over this. He talked about in interviews how much he wanted the animators who came from all different parts of the country, of the world, to make this movie. He really wanted to empower them as actors. And that's something that in the animation community we talk about a lot, is how character animation is acting. And I think the physicality of the stop motion, which is something Camille's really talked about here, and I think beautifully, is imparted onto these characters. And it's so amazing to watch. And when if you have any chance to hear Guillermo del Toro talk about anything, you should do it, because he is a dynamic speaker. He is incredibly engaging and charismatic. And when he talks about animation, it really, you fall in love with it again. And I think that is something that is evident in every frame of this film. And I've heard rumblings around the animation community, especially my friends at DreamWorks, who will talk about their film Puss in Boots later, about how, oh, well, that's not, my kids didn't like it as much as our film or these other things. But like, really, it is pushing, to me, the medium of animation. It is something that's like saying, hey, we can be different. And it can have a larger or a different kind of audience. Maybe it isn't for kids, but like, it has elements of it that any kid can relate to, and it has something that adults can look at and sort of tack onto. And the other thing about it is, look at the voice cast on this and how well they read their parts. It's really amazing. The voice of Geppetto is a longtime actor that Guillermo had worked with before, and Ron Perlman's in this, and like, there's just really a wealth of talent oozing out of this. I particularly love the scenes in which Pinocchio dies and goes to this other world. Those scenes are beautiful, just stunning.
That creature design was absolutely incredible.
Right, absolutely. Just really amazing to watch. And then even if you get a chance to look at the behind the scenes, how large, like in order to make Jiminy Cricket work, like this is giant head. Like there's photos I've seen of like Guillermo del Toro next to the head, and it's like bigger than him, in order to make, and so you use the word miniature, but it's not really that miniature at all. Sometimes it's a maximature, right? So it's crazy, but it's really a lovely movie, and I was absolutely enthralled by it when I watched it, and I'm happy for Guillermo to have this opportunity and to get the recognition that I think this film so richly deserves, and also for Netflix. I think Klaus was one of the first films that they did that was nominated for an Oscar. I loved Klaus, and to have another one here with this film, I think they have a real shot at winning an Oscar with this film, and deservedly so. I think this film is amazing and beautiful, and it has something to say. I mean, Pinocchio is a well-known story, and yet it has something to say. And I think that's really a fascinating thing, that he was able to take it and sort of reimagine it in a way that isn't derivative of itself. And I thought that was really great.
The other thing I really loved about this film that I took away was the focus of Pinocchio really being able to be a child, and Geppetto learning how to be a father instead of Pinocchio learning to be a real boy. Like, he was always a boy. Kids are troublemakers. They get into mischief. But Geppetto really, he had the character arc of kind of coming into fatherhood.
Actually, it's fascinating you should say that. It's true. Like, he struggles with being a parent. He gets frustrated, and it's almost his story and his tragic backstory with his boy Carlo, who passes away, and his idea that maybe he can replace him, but then realize it's not the same. I think that there's some real adult themes in this film that are of loss that are really important, that really work. And even the idea that Pinocchio outlasts them all, like that is the fascinating conundrum for him in this film that I think is unresolved in a good way. There are no easy answers in this film.
It's beautiful.
I want to step back and ask you both a question that I think is relevant to this film and to our next entry. Now, Best Animated Feature is sort of like Best Picture for animated films. And so all these different elements of story and how it comes together all matter as far as the film that gets selected. But from a technical perspective, do you have any difficulty comparing the stop motion animated films versus the computer generated or CGI animated films in the same category like this?
It's interesting that you should ask that, because I was thinking about that before we spoke today, about Marcel the Shell with Shoes On, and just how it's live action and stop motion. And that's nominated for Best Animated Feature. But then I was thinking about Avatar, and then I was having this philosophical argument with myself about what is animation?
What is animation? What about the Lion King, the John Favreau Lion King? All of that was animated. Or the Jungle Book, where only the boy was live action. And I don't know why this voice came. I don't know where this voice came.
I don't know. But everything is animated.
I think it is challenging. I do. In the same way, last week, Chris Batty and I talked about visual effects and the difference between a supporting visual effects film and a visual effects driven film. It's a little bit apples and oranges. I think the artistry of doing something frame by frame, whether it's on a computer or it's by hand, that is constant. And because I work in a computer all day, I feel more of an appreciation, I think, for the stop motion and the labor it takes to make that kind of effort. And also the decision making, how much more challenging it is to go back and revise it after you've got it in the can. Even a day of shooting, you have to go back and redo it. Even though we redo stuff all the time in CG animation, there's something, it just feels more difficult to me. And so I guess I have a lot of appreciation for stop motion films because of that. And maybe I waited a little bit more, but it's charming. There's something undeniably charming. And I think maybe it's the kid in everyone that feels that you can reach out and touch it, that makes it different than an SCG film. I think that it is challenging to compare, even within the industry itself, to do it. And I think Camille is also correct that Avatar is mostly animated. It's not nominated, obviously, but would that put it in technically in the category, just like The Lion King is mostly animated? Why wasn't that in Best Animated Feature? You sort of don't know the answer to that question. It's not something that's very clear anymore.
And I know there was a big push to have Guillermo del Toro's Pinocchio, considered for Best Picture as well. So
it is a great debate to have. And it's actually, I like doing this podcast because we talk about all these different kinds of movies, and I think they're each great. in their own way. And that's what's
Mhm.
fascinating about the medium. Like it's something that can sort of span multiple types of animation.
Absolutely.
Well, this issue is also relevant with our next film, Marcel the Shell with Shoes On. Credited team is Dean Fleischer Camp, Elizabeth Holm, Andrew Goldman, Caroline Kaplan, and Paul Measy.
I absolutely loved Marcel the Shell. Like it was for me one of my favorite films of last year, and it actually one of the more surprising movies I watched. I think that the word I would use to describe it, whimsical. It has this charm for me that is fascinating. I watched this with my wife, and ironically, I work in the animation industry. My wife is not an animation fan. I'm always curious what she thinks of movies, and she loved this movie. She actually recommended this to all her friends to go see this film. I just thought that was interesting that it could transcend even a skeptic of animation. I think it's a very meta movie, and if you know anything about the story of how this was made, I think that there's something very interesting about how this came about. So this is really the brainchild of the actress Jenny Slate, who's in a lot of movies. If you don't know who she is, once you see her, you'd recognize her. She's the voice of Marcel, and she had conceived this, I believe, with Dean Fleischer Camp. They went to a wedding and with a bunch of friends, and when you're young and you can't afford hotels, you crash in the same hotel together, and like they were all on top of each other, and that's when she invented this character of Marcel the Shell, and it was like literally a character with a googly eye, and she made up this sort of small voice for it, and they came up with these little small documentaries that they put on YouTube, and they became very popular. And that ended up, causing there to be some excitement about making a feature out of it. And so when you watch the movie, it's literally that story of like, oh, this filmmaker Dean, who's Dean Fleischer Camp, lives in his house like after breaking up with his girlfriend. And I do think that Dean and, if I'm not mistaken, and Jenny Slate were together, and
They were married.
yeah, when they started, they got divorced and still made the movie. I think. I don't think they're
Yeah.
together now.
No, they're not.
So like, it's kind of this weird. That's why I call it a meta movie, right? So in the movie, Dean goes to live in this Airbnb, I think it is, discovers Marcel and starts filming Marcel and posting them on YouTube, and that causes a buzz, and Marcel becomes a YouTube sensation, and that leads to like them getting on 60 Minutes and meeting Marcel and Isabella Rossellini's hero
Leslie
Leslie
Stahl.
Stahl, who's now in the movie, who helps them find like it's just crazy. I haven't seen a meta movie like this since that one about Mr. Brainwash, the documentary, Exit Through the Back of the Gift Shop. It's similar to me in that way of like it sort of knows itself and is a bit of a wink and a nod to itself. I didn't know any of that until after I saw the film. And so it was fascinating on many different levels, on a subtext level. Like we always talk about artists working out their issues in the medium of whatever it is, with the sculpture, painting, photography, that kind of thing. And it seems like they're working out some things while making this movie, which is part of the charm for me about the film, is it felt kind of in this really interesting documentary style that is unusual for animation. From a technical standpoint, they were writing it and recording the audio along the way and revising it. So there was like this improvisation, but yet written style. Then they shot the footage, the live action footage, without obviously Marcel in it. They put a dummy Marcel just for like to get the light values. And then they had to go back and camera track all of the live action photography that they cut in, and then reshoot just the stop motion part, match the lighting, and then do the composite. So from a technical standpoint, this is probably one of the more technically difficult movies that were made, just because it combines two live action shoots. It has the writing improvisation style. It has the rewriting and the constant changing of the story. The legendary Chodo brothers did the character animation. So there's a lot in this film that I find really amazing in that it got made in the manner that it did. It took a long time to get made. It's another one.
It took 7 years.
So like, and again, like the sticking to it, like sticking to getting this thing made, like that's the kind of fortitude it takes to make an animated film sometimes. It's fascinating to me.
This one for me, it took me a little while to watch it. I had no idea about the shorts, so I watched it after watching the movie. It's funny because it really is, actually some of the lines from the original short from 2010 are in the film, and it's that little character. So I thought it was really, poignant and emotional. There are so many little whimsical thoughts that Marcel has that really resonate with anybody who's gone through a loss, or there's this mystery of the family being gone and you don't really know what happened. You discover that as the film goes on, and you really get close to this little shell wearing shoes
with the googly eye.
And so
the googly eye this year is big. Googly eye this had a year in cinema. Let's just face it.
But it is this really beautiful film, and Isabella Rossellini is fantastic as Grandmother Connie.
Yes, Grandmother Connie. Isabella Rossellini. That's crazy. They got her to be in this movie. Could you imagine pitching this movie to her?
Yeah, you're going to be a shell.
What? Apparently she was great with the improv and was just had a lot of questions, but in a good way about the character and what's going on. And I read an interview with the filmmaker that they loved working with Isabella Rossellini and how great she was.
I imagine. And also Leslie Stahl. I feel like any film that brings in 60 minutes is, wow, okay by me. But Jenny Slate, that voice, because she also does voices. She was in Bob's Burgers.
Yep.
So she also was in Bob's Burger, the movie this year, which is animated. Big Mouth, I think she does a voice or two. And then Secret Life of Pets. So, she's been around in live action and animation for quite some time. But this one, it's a beautiful film.
It surprised me. I'm not sure I would have caught it with my normal viewing habits, but I had the opportunity to interview the production designer, Liz Tunkel, for the podcast last season. So I had a chance to go to a screening. And so sitting there in the theater and watching it, it just surprised me how they managed to be sentimental, but never kind of be maudlin, to always undercut it with just the right amount of humor
Right.
for me, as far as maintaining that balance. And I think both this and with Pinocchio, we talked about before, you can see the advantage of, I think, some of these long production schedules in really working to get the story you want on screen. We're going to be very deliberate about what the story is and what it says. And I think that pays off for both of these films.
It's the animation schedule is very interesting compared to a live action. It's a double-edged sword for sure. It's one where you could end up just revising and revising and revising forever, and that's a trap that can happen. But in both those these films, Pinocchio and Marcel, I think you see the advantage of filmmakers really reacting on this film, especially the improvisation that happened with the recording of the voices, and then going back and shooting the live action plate, and then allowing that to sort of become part of this process, I think created a unique film. And having the practice of doing the little YouTube shorts, I think really paid off. You were able to try out material in a manner, and of course the YouTube ones were really much more lo-fi. They weren't as well animated, and they didn't, they were fine. They were for the medium that they were in, or for the YouTube place that it was in. It was great. But to see it elevated, I thought was great. I think the Chodo Bros, if you don't know who they are, they did RoboCop. They did the stop motion Elf. They did a bunch of stuff in Bram Stoker's Dracula, the Coppola Dracula, American Werewolf in London, and Gremlin. So they've been around since 1982. So if you're a fan of stop, there's two areas. So you got the Chodo Brothers who are in LA, the San Fernando Valley, and then you have all of Portland. Portland is where every single stop motion person lives now, apparently, because Leica's there.
Shadow Machine.
Yeah, that's where they did Pinocchio. So you have these little hubs of stop motion and these artisans who really have crafted, it takes a long time to get good at that. There's not a lot of schools teaching it. So these people that are the experts have been around doing it for a long time. And I think it shows.
I don't know if you saw, but the director of this, he's directing Disney's live action remake of Lilo and Stitch.
Well, there you go. I guess that's a whole other podcast we can have about the Disney. Let's make a live action version of every animated film that's been a hit,
like Pinocchio.
Yeah, I'm not going to touch that. Maybe we shouldn't talk about.
Let's not. Let's move on. Moving on.
But I was really charmed by this, and it was funny because I was watching a bunch of films over the holiday, and I generally was we have to watch these animated films with my family. And this was the one that really seemed to charm my family the most, was Marcel the Shell. I have to confess that it bridged that gap, and I appreciate that. Because they aren't the target audience maybe for an animated film, my family, because they don't have necessarily the penchant, even though I'm working in the industry. I'm not bitter about that at all.
Let me know what you both thought, and Kent, what your family thought of the third film on our list, Puss in Boots: The Last Wish. The credited team is Joel Crawford and Mark Swift.
Puss in Boots: The Last Wish. Kent and I both worked at DreamWorks, and so we're very familiar with all of the people who worked on this film. I fully enjoyed this movie. I was 100% in for this film. I did watch it with my daughter who just turned 8, and she did not want anything to do with this film after that wolf showed up.
Interesting.
So,
You mean death?
I mean, when death showed up, my daughter was out.
Spoiler.
I know, sorry, everyone. I did think that, the design of the wolf and just the red eye, like that is a scary character. But overall, I felt like it was a really refreshing film. I think it's the 6th movie that has to do it in the Shrek universe.
The Shrekverse. The Shrekverse.
Shrek
Very similar to the Marvel Cinematic Universe.
Yes. Just the look of it. I mean, I felt these like Spider-Verse design vibes. Everything was, much more painterly than a lot of the previous Shrek films where it's hyper realistic and, you see every little detailed hair. But in this one, it's more brush strokes. And when they had these battles, the action lines was kind of like more comic-esque, which was kind of new for DreamWorks in this, Shrekverse. So I really enjoyed it. And of course, the humor I thought was spot on.
This film, actually, this year for DreamWorks is an interesting year. I think it's a year that DreamWorks really experimented with their quote house style. When you look back at sort of the history of animation, the Spider-Verse, Enter the Spider-Verse was a landmark. And it gave permission, I think, to studios like DreamWorks to stop chasing the Disney/Pixar bar. And I think the technical bar of Pixar and DreamWorks, and we'll get to another Pixar movie later in this podcast, is like they do the simulation, they do the physics-based lighting, they do all of the realism and the fur, and like their backgrounds almost look photographic. Like sometimes the only thing that gives away the fact that it's a CG movie or an animated film are the character designs, right? And I think for the longest time, DreamWorks chased that. And it wasn't because the artists didn't want to try different things. I just think that they got guided there by partly because of the tools, partly because of the studio leadership, and partly because that's what was expected. This show really exemplifies that experimentation, like the permission to experiment. And what blew me away most were the action scenes that Camille's talking about. They feel different from the rest of the movie to me. Like they're shot on twos, which when you say we're shot on twos, that means that the character animation only has keyframes on every second frame. So it holds every other frame. And so it creates this steppy feel, but like this almost stop motion-y, but steppy feel. And it makes the pose that much stronger. And it feels almost 2D. And the camera work, the head of layout on this was Chris Stover. And it feels as if all of a sudden we become an anime film. You add the lines and the painterly look and the dynamic movement of the camera. It just goes into this place where I'm like, whoa, what's going on with this movie? And it's super engaging. As someone who grew up like liking anime, I was really excited by this film. I just thought it was super interesting. I really liked watching it. I thought the painterly backgrounds were great. I think that is something that you should look for in this film and compare it to the original Puss in Boots and see how different it looks and feels from that film, even though Puss, the design is the same, Kitty Southpaw, Softpaw. Sorry, Selma, is in the back of the movie and is great, and she's a great character. Actually, the Goldilocks and the Three Bears, Florence Pugh is Goldilocks.
Fantastic.
Like the voice acting is great in this. I have a real soft spot for this because Mark Swift is the producer. He came from PDI where both Camille and I worked.
Swifty. And
he has a long-time producer at DreamWorks. And to, be part of the nomination on this is fantastic. I'm so happy for him and the efforts you feel like there's a producer who's finally recognized for the amount of effort and work he's put into his career. And if you know anything about the history of this film, it labored. It started before, I think, NBC Universal took it over. It had Fall Starts is maybe too strong a word, but like two different creative teams that started this film. And then I think this is the third creative team, and the one that finished it is actually this one. They had several different people attempt to crack this movie. It's not a simple movie to make. And I know it seems that way. Oh, yeah, well, they made Puss in Boots 1. That was so many years ago. So why would they make another one? They've been trying to make this film for, I would say, almost decades now. And to finish it now and see the result, it's really fantastic and fun. It's getting a lot of recognition on the critics side. I think it's a dark horse to win. I think it could possibly win the Oscar here. I think critically, it's one of the best reviewed films in DreamWorks history. It's doing great at the box office. It has legs. The key to a success of an anime film really is that how long can it sustain its run? And it's sustaining a long run right now at the box office, both here and internationally. I think that shows the appeal of Puss in Boots beyond the domestic borders. This one's got it for sure. It's just continuing to rise throughout the weeks. And I think it's doing very well from a financial standpoint. Good for DreamWorks. As so many of my friends have worked on it and are proud of this film. Jim Ryan, the editor, I've worked with him before. He's a longtime editor in the field. He's actually an actor in Home Alone, just so everyone knows. He was in Home Alone. Yeah, you didn't know that?
What?
Look him up. Look him up.
I didn't.
He's a
Oh
really
my
great
gosh.
editor, and to have him get recognition. So I think for a lot of people at DreamWorks, this is like a good moment for them and a deserved moment. So I feel that is earned. It looks great. They're very proud of it. I think
Yeah.
for me, the standout is the painterly when they really go full on it, and it comes out really in the action stuff. I think they did a great job shooting those sequences.
I feel like this has been such a great year for DreamWorks just between this and Bad Guys. Like I
Yeah,
know Bad Guys wasn't nominated, but Bad Guys is a great film. I fully enjoyed watching it.
I think Bad Guys paved the way for this film. That's why this year is extraordinary for DreamWorks, is I think they really saw a progression. I remember talking to my friends at DreamWorks, and they're like, "Do you know what movie's really good?" And they're like sort of baffled by it. No, Puss in Boots, Puss in Boots. And like, they were, no, really. I know you're skeptical, but like almost like they knew the moment you say the words Puss in Boots, people are like, yeah, right, okay, we've seen that, been there, like whatever. But give this movie a chance if you haven't. Like, really go see it.
Yeah.
I think it's really something that's extraordinary, like for them as a studio.
But I want to explore that a little deeper about the change in styles. And you guys have both talked about it. Clearly, when I was watching it, I noticed again the action sequences are different, and I hadn't made the connection. But Camille, you brought up Into the Spider-Verse, and now I'm seeing that sort of approach. But the non-action stuff, the general dialogue, seems to be in a much more traditional style.
Yeah.
And I feel on some level that the shift was a little disconcerting. I loved the style of Into the Spider-Verse, but I'm wondering if they didn't really have the courage of their convictions to push the entire film in a new direction. And I found that the shift in some ways made it a little harder for me to follow. And I found myself questioning the change more than necessarily really getting into the action, because then we'd go back. And so then the next action sequence, again, I'm adjusting how I view it. And I think that hurts the film a little bit. It hurt it for me, at least.
That's interesting.
You're not the first person to tell me that, to be frank. Like, I think that is something that is an interesting comment and an observation. Clearly, no one wants to be taken out of the movie. So in that way, you as an audience member, it worked against it. I don't know enough about the technical aspect. I wasn't at DreamWorks when they made this. I would argue that like that style, the painterly style, is very hard to achieve and be consistent about. So I could see there being a case not knowing that maybe that was a choice of like, well, we're dipping our toe in, maybe we can't go fully into that, because of pipeline limitations or technical limitations or even time. Like, you can do this other thing. Also, it has to relate to the other films. Like, it can't just all of a sudden change and be different. And if you look at the new characters versus the old characters, for example, Puss in Boots versus, Camille, do you remember the name of the little dog or
Perrito.
Like, if you look at Perrito's fur versus Puss in Boots' fur, there literally are like little brushstrokes on the fur of Perrito that are not on Puss in Boots. Sometimes you have this thing where you want to make sure you pay attention to making sure the character relates to the previous film, but then you can take more risks maybe with the newer characters. I'm not saying that's what happened. I don't know enough behind the scenes to know about that.
They definitely were pushing it.
Yeah.
They definitely were pushing the style.
Yeah. Spider-Verse is interesting because it changes all the time. Like, it does for me. Like, you see almost every scene sequence has slightly different variation, but I think that's part of the kinetic energy of that film, and it helps make it feel the way it does, and it's successful in that way. And maybe for you as an audience member, Skid, that when you saw it, it popped you out, and in some ways that maybe that's unsuccessful. I was enthralled by it. I just thought it was super fascinating. And part of me is the fan of animation to see it. Like, I just like seeing that kind of stuff, something different. But at the same time, like, it shouldn't take you out of the movie. And so, like, in that way, maybe it's not as successful. We could argue about that. But I loved it. I was like super into it.
No, that's so funny. I feel like I had the same feeling as Kent, right? Like when those scenes came up, I was like, oh man, it's different. I love it. But yeah, I mean, if we're just coming from the world of animation, we're watching things with different eyes,
Right. I didn't ask my family about it. I forced my family to watch this movie because my friends said we're gonna watch it over the holiday. We watched it. And Skid, to your question, I would say my family was more of a fan of Marcel than of Puss in Boots. Like, that's their feeling about it, as far as a lay person watching the film. I think that part of the problem for them, they felt it took a little longer to get going. The beginning it takes a while for the film, the picture, to get its legs. There's this big dance number, sort of almost a musical number in the beginning, and then the big fight in the giants before we actually get to the core of the story of like evading death and the fear of death being the thing that motivates Puss. It takes a while to get there. So I think that was one of their criticisms. They just took a long time to get going, which I thought was an interesting observation. We talk about this in our last podcast about visual effects. Sometimes you're watching a movie with the hat of the film goer, just a regular film. Sometimes you're watching it as a craft person, and it's hard to like disengage each aspect of it and to go fully into one or the other. One of the things I read about that was fascinating is how much, I guess, psychologists or therapists like the depiction of the panic attack.
Yes.
And I think that's something that from an emotional standpoint, I would ask the listeners here to watch for, is the depiction of the panic attack, about how true that is to how people feel when suffering a panic attack. And I think that's a hard thing to do, is to take something an emotional reality and to depict it in an animated sense and make somebody feel something, like feel like, oh, that's what it feels like for me. And I think it was super successful.
Yeah. And really shifts Puss's perspective on life. That was really, an interesting thing that they added in there, because if he didn't have some kind of really serious thing affecting him, I don't know if his character shift would have been as believable. And I wonder, what's coming next, because now they go visit their friends in far, far away.
Oh man, I smell Shrek 5 coming around the corner.
Shrek's a coming back.
This one doing as well as it is. I'm sure there is another movie coming through. We'll have to see what they do with it. Until then, we'll move on to the fourth movie on our list, The Sea Beast. And the credited team is Chris Williams and Jed Schlanger.
So Jed is another DreamWorks alum. So I'll fully show my bias. I love my DreamWorks alum. I got to work with Jed as the boss baby. He came in and really helped land that plane, so to speak. He's a great producer. He's a great animation producer, a great guy. Sea Beast is amazing to me. And I remember talking to some of my friends who worked on it and saying, wow, that film looks expensive. Like, I'm impressed about the scope and scale of that film. If you want to see a movie that's not done at Pixar or Disney, that is way expensive in terms of like, they spent a lot of money to make that thing look great, is Sea Beast. And that Sony was the vendor on that. The water simulation is extraordinary. And some people will say, oh, well, we figured out water law. You saw Titanic. I'm like, this is at a whole other level. The interaction with the giant sea beasts and the ships is absolutely phenomenal. And it's like so well done. And once you're like saying, we're going to make a movie on the ocean, for most of the movie, like 70% of the movie takes place on the ocean. Like, it's a tough film to shoot. It's going to be expensive. There's no lock. There are going to not be lock-offs. You're going to be in motion all the time. The characters have to have weight and shifting weight all the time. That's an animation lift. There's the simulation of anytime you see water, that's simulated. So that's an effects lift there. I got the tip of the hat to Damon O'Barron, longtime DreamWorks head of layout, for the cinematography on this film. It's extraordinary. And like, to get the sea beast to feel large, you're shooting overcranked in some way to make them feel bigger, but at the same time, it's exciting. So like, that's the thing about a large moving object like a sea beast. Like, you're trying to make it feel big, but you don't want it to be boring and take forever to make their turns. And it reminded me a lot of Master and Commander. I loved Master and Commander. I don't care what anyone says, that movie's awesome. So you should see Master. It's a live action movie. See Master Commander. So like, that's a great film. And part of what makes these two films and what connects them is their attention to detail on the seafaring.
Well, it's the same boat. Did you know they went to that boat?
No, it's the same boat.
Well, I mean, they studied that boat, like they visited that boat and like the Master and Commander boat.
Okay, so like, this all makes sense because the authenticity in the film is extraordinary. And I don't know anything about boats. So let me get that out there right now. I did speak to a bunch of people about who worked on it. They had consultants come in and talk about like, how do we make the ship turn? What are the maneuvers you have to do? What ropes do you pull on? And what people don't realize is like, when you model the boat, the ship, even if you model an accurate ship, you have to rig it, meaning you have to make things move in a certain way so that the sails move, and you have to know which sails move when to basically articulate a turn. And there's a moment where they do, I think it's called a crossing the T in order to get broadside with the sea beast to like harpoon it. And they paid attention to all of the, like, what are the things you have to do in order? What are the steps you have to take to do it? And while you don't have to be an expert to know it's right, you feel it. And I think that's the extraordinary thing about filmmaking in general, whether it's a live action film or an animated film, is that when people pay attention to the details, you don't know it, you just feel it. And I think in this film, you really feel the attention to detail. And I was super impressed by it. Like, this could easily have been like a paint by numbers seafaring movie, but it felt big and it felt right. And I was really impressed with the filmmaking on here. It's extraordinarily well done. I worked on a giant monster movie, this Rumble movie. This to me, like I can't. Damon Albarn blows me away. That's why he was called the Godfather of layout at DreamWorks, because he's so good. And I think what he did here with the cinematography, it's even in some of the reviews I saw called out, is extraordinary.
Well, it's that sense of scale, right? Like it's so challenging to really capture that giant sea beast, this little girl, and really understand and feel the hugeness of that creature. But I wanted to go back to just the ropes, because
Let's talk about ropes. Let's talk about ropes.
Ken. On that ship, I think there are 5,000 or so ropes that connect, and yes, they work. And just the details of being able to command a ship, thinking about the wind and the sail, and just all those different elements that go into creating a shot in this film, because there's hundreds of them on that boat on the water. It's unbelievable.
Yeah.
And by the way, and the expensive part, as you were talking about, I was like, oh my gosh, like the producers must have just had a heart attack.
Oh.
Like Jed must have had a heart attack.
Jed probably lost 4 years of his life working on that film. By the way, this was done during the pandemic. It started in an office and went to the pandemic. And then, so they had to figure out their whole, we talked about this last year, but it's still like, this is a carryover of that phenomena. Like they had to figure out how to finish this movie at home. Again, no easy feat.
Yeah. And Chris Williams left Disney after 25 years to come to Netflix and make this. It was a real passion project.
The thing about when you hear about directors, it's great when you hear they're great guys. So I know a few people that worked on this film, and one of them, Stephanie Kiter, big shout out to Stephanie Kiter, Extreme Merker, now on Turtles, doing a great job. She was saying that one thing she could say about Chris was he was the hardest working person on the show. She said this guy came in every day, had done the homework. She said he was late to only one meeting, and he was extremely apologetic to everyone in that meeting when he was late. And I don't know if I've ever worked on a film where the director was on time to every meeting. And that's extraordinary. That's that kind of, I just feel that there should be something said about that. I've never met Chris. I don't know anything about him, but when I hear that, I'm impressed. I think that kind of behavior should be rewarded, and I think it shows in this film and the care in this movie.
I'm working with him now, so we'll see what's next.
The last film on our list is Turning Red, and the credited team is Domi Shi and Lindsay Collins.
So here we go, Turning Red, another Pixar film nominated. Disney and Pixar have kind of dominated this category.
A little.
a little for the past, however many years it's existed as a category. and Turning Red it's Domi Shi's, her feature directorial debut. She had previously directed the short film Bow at Pixar. And I heard, the way she pitched it was like, this is a magical puberty film, which is kind of and I really enjoyed this film. I thought it was a really different film for Pixar. I mean, it's definitely, as a former teenage girl, I can absolutely identify with just the their bonkers hormones just jumping around their bodies and being obsessed with the boy band and the guy who works in the convenience store and their little drawing and just all those feelings. And so it was really nice to see Domi really getting to tell her story, because I know she grew up in Toronto, and so Canada, Toronto are a huge part of this film. Having this red panda emerge as a sign of her kind of going through puberty, it's hilarious, but it's also really, really poignant and kind of like Pinocchio. It's almost like a story where the mother has to learn how to mother her daughter in a way, which is kind of a similar theme, because she comes to accept that she's not going to imprison her panda.
Her inner panda.
Her inner panda.
That's right. I read that she described it when she was pitching it as an Asian tween fever dream, which I think is an appropriate description of it. I think it's a very un-Pixar movie in a lot of ways. Like I was really surprised by this movie, by some of the choices in this movie, because it is so un-Pixar. I think the boy band particularly, and the emphasis on the boy band, I thought was, wow, we're really going to do this. We're really going to have, oh no, we're going to a concert. Oh, wait a minute. They're performing like Backstreet Boys or NSYNC.
I know, it's all NSYNC.
Now I'm really dating myself. That's what the boy bands I know. I'm not saying any K-pop bands. I'm saying,
Well, it's supposed to be in the early 2000s.
I get it. But it's one of those things where like usually Pixar is a little bit more timeless in its choices, like of like, oh, you're not supposed to really understand what time this is happening, but this is very specific, and the specificity is different. And it was for me like, whoa, okay, so we're gonna do this. It took me a second to sort of get my bearings on that specificity of some of those things. I think that the editing style also, it's a lot more fast cutting than the other Pixar films that I'm used to seeing. So I think they took a lot of risks here. You can see the evolution of, like, for me, the character designs from Luca. Like you can definitely see the influence of Luca to this one.
The mouth shapes.
Yeah, the mouth is like we talked about this in our last year's podcast, the mouth shapes in Luca. And I think you see them here, right? So here's a technology or like a method or a technique, maybe technology is the wrong word, it's a combination of all the above that created this ability to create these really round mouths, which are heavily influenced by Miyazaki, who has influenced this filmmaker, Domi Shi, and now it's used in this film. So she describes her animation pedigree or growing. Yeah, we always talk about the films that influenced us. And she says it was, Miyazaki, Warner Brothers, and Disney. And if I say that, you watch this film, you see all of that in this film. You see those influences. Whereas I think a lot of the other films, whether it's a Disney film or a Pixar, you see the classic Disney influence. And I think this is definitely a multitude of different influences on the animation style and character design. And like I said, the editing of the film, like it's all sort of there in that way that is very different from what Pixar normally or has done in the past. So, and she's the Oscar winner for her short bow, and so to see the what she comes up with in this it heralds the next generation of Pixar filmmaker in a lot of ways, like here in this one. And I think it does, one of the things that's successful about it is the fact that it is autobiographical. We talk a little bit in the filmmaking world, like having to have a personal connection to the film in order to add to that or contribute to it in some way. And I think this feels very personal to her. You can sense that this was what she was like, like she had not, maybe she did have a red pen that we don't know about, but like, like you get the sense that this was her.
Absolutely. And I think just, I don't know, I mean, teenage girls, they don't get, feel like not many films are made about these kind of like intelligent teenage girls who are going through something. And so it was really beautiful to see that on screen for me.
I don't know if I've ever seen an animated film about this particular subject ever.
Yeah. And they weren't like mean girls or anything like that. Like they were just your average, this is just a story about a family and these teen girls that I think any teen girl could identify with. So I really enjoyed that.
And I think the idea of the first generation immigrant coming to the country, and trying to resolve your immigrant, your where you came from, along with the new country you're in, and the pull of that first generation that's born in this country and trying to find your way and navigating between the two is something I definitely related to in terms of my own personal upbringing. There is something I think universal about the immigrant story that like is especially in the United States for sure, but obviously this is in Canada. But I think that story is a very universal story of trying to resolve where you came from with where you are, and I think that's in the DNA of the film. That it feels very authentic. Also, the shout out Billie Eilish wrote the songs with Phineas, her brother, just so everyone knows. So if you're a Billie Eilish fan, she's the one who wrote the song. So like,
get the soundtrack.
So of course Pixar gets Billie Eilish, right? Like,
well, of course. I mean, you pick up the phone and they show up.
Yeah, you're like, oh yeah, we're Pixar. You're gonna come do this, and I'm sure it was like yes.
And they say yes.
But I think it's a refreshing, different kind of film for Pixar. This is an interesting story about like just it being on streaming. So for the last couple of years, the Pixar movies have been released on streaming, and there's been much debate online in the online world, which we don't really care too much about, except for the podcast is online, so we care about it. Is that has the releasing of Pixar movies on streaming when not going to the theater hurt the brand? And while this is not relevant to this film, it's a question because their other film this year, Lightyear, was released in theaters and did not receive the box office it normally does. There was some criticism about that film, and there was some talk about that. So it's an interesting side debate that is something that was talked about as far as like, how would this have done in a theater release? Would this film have made a good amount of money like in the past? The box office is very different now because of the pandemic, but it's still a question of like, has Disney hurt the Pixar brand by doing the release schedule that they have?
Yeah, and we'll see, now that we're kind of, we're back in the theaters and studios are not hesitating to release at this point.
Yeah.
It'll be interesting to see kind of the rest of this year how the box office is.
Yeah. It's part of the business that you have to sort of figure out as far as like that goes. But I think it's a really good film. I commend Dominique Shi, the next generation of Pixar filmmaker.
She's in good company. This is a strong slate of films this year. An embarrassment of riches almost. With even what struck me as odd about Puss, I still enjoyed the film. And again, all of these films, I think it's going to be a tough one.
I think it's a tough choice for Academy voters this year. People like to say, well, the Disney one wins or the Pixar one wins, but I don't think it's a shoe-in for anybody to win. I think the early momentum has clearly been for Pinocchio, but you never know when you get to the Oscar time. And Disney's great at ramping up the PR machine as it gets closer. I think that, Turning Red has a good shot at it. I think Puss in Boots has a shot.
Puss in Boots has legs right now. It's on everybody's mind.
I've seen a lot of articles about Puss in Boots, about how good a film that is. And so I think that you'd have to really consider Pinocchio, Puss in Boots, and Turning Red as the front runners, like somewhere there. There was some other three. I mean, like Sea Beast is probably the hardest pull out of the bunch if you're doing your Oscar voting, your betting vote. But it doesn't mean it couldn't win. And certainly Marcel the Shell is a dark horse as well. It's a good year for animated films to me. There's a good diversity in types of films and content.
Are there any other 2022 films that you want to give a shout out? Now, and again, with these films, no spoilers, but things that didn't make this list, but you think are worth people finding.
I want to just give a shout out to My Father's Dragon from Cartoon Saloon, based on the children's book. It's beautiful. And it's in that kind of Cartoon Saloon style, and just really, really enjoyed that. So bummed out that it didn't get nominated and didn't get more recognition, because I think it's a really beautifully done 2D animated film. That is one thing in this year, there are no 2D animated films represented. And the other one I'm selfishly missing is Intergalactic. From Netflix, but only because I worked on it. So
shout out to Netflix. Home team for you. Home team.
I just thought it was really beautiful and different, and I'm a fan of just that animation is filmed and just cracking open the door to look at different kinds of projects that are made in this medium.
I'll give a shout out to the other DreamWorks film this year, The Bad Guys. I think that film, in many ways, paved the way for Puss in Boots. I think if you like a heist film, it's fun as a heist film. It has Sam Rockwell's voice with it. Come on, everyone loves Sam Rockwell. I mean, come on, that guy's great. It's a fun film, and I think in many ways, your criticism, Skid, you had about Puss in Boots, I think Bad Guys is very cohesive in its look. It's not as painterly and as anime style as Puss gets, but it has its own style. That is not the DreamWorks quote house style or the past house style. I think nowadays you would say that they're reaching far beyond that to other things depending on what the film is. And I applaud that. And I like to applaud the filmmakers on Bad Guys. I really enjoyed it. I thought it was a fun movie. I really liked that film.
I did too. I thought it was like Ocean's 11.
There's a lot of sort of like, how do they do it kind of thing? How do you pull off the heist? And those are really fun scenes.
Well, listeners, this is a good year for animated films. I don't think you can go wrong with any of these. On that note, we're going to call it a wrap. So much fun having you guys on the show. Thanks so much.
Thanks
you for having us.
It's great to have you on with Camille Leganza.
So good to be with Kent Seki again.
He's awesome.
Aw, miss you, buddy.
Miss you too.
Listeners, I always appreciate your feedback. You'll find my contact info at our website, belowtheline.oneword.biz. That's B-I-Z. Thanks to Curtis Five for our music and John Wan for our logo. The logo is available on t-shirts, mugs, and stickers at redbubble.com. To all of our listeners, I appreciate you. Please rate us wherever you get your podcasts and tell your friends. Thanks again from Below the Line. Quick question. Can you guys hear noise on my side? I'm getting it loud, but if it's not getting picked up in the mic, yay, blanket fort. Okay.
Yeah, not hearing it.
Okay, yeah, your blanket fort is strong. I
love a good blanket fort sound studio.